So hello, everyone. Good evening. Great to have you here all at History Colorado and all of you on remote land. We got a pretty good crowd on this very special lecture. It's not just another lecture. This is MAP month. This is a very special time for us because we dedicate a full month on a topic. And that topic this month, it's about how no matter what map you have in your hands, from the 15th century to Google Maps, you may think that it's just a way to show you some of the routes or how to get from one point to another. But if you look closely, you will see that every map has an intention. It has an objective by the author that is driving you to see certain things and certain that they don't want you to see. So that's what's called persuasive maps. And that's the theme of our map month. And to talk about the map month, the various speakers, and to introduce our speaker, we have Mr. Chris Lane, that actually is the one that came up with this idea years ago. And so every year, this is his time. So Chris, can you come?
Yes, okay. Oh, actually, I don't remember, other than the fact that next week is Susan Schulten. We have a terrific lineup, and starting with the dean of persuasive maps, if I can use that expression. But it's the idea is that for 4 weeks, in conjunction with History Colorado, which is graciously working with us, we're going to have topics related to persuasive maps, and this is sort of a great introductory lecture, and Susan will explain a bit about why that is so.
Hello, everyone online, and hello, everyone here. I'm Susan Schulten. I teach American history at the University of Denver. And I actually asked to introduce PJ because he has been a co-conspirator and a friend and a colleague for so long. We've been trading notes on maps for a long, long time. And I just briefly wanted to highlight what I think is so significant about his work. PJ, you may know, had a long and stellar career in the law, first in Washington, D.C., and now more recently in New York, a career from which he is retired. And while he was in that career, his interest in maps actually began. It began as early as 1980. And I thought it was fascinating that both PJ and I were transformed by the very important exhibit, The Power of Maps, that was at the Cooper Hewitt and then at the Smithsonian in 1992. It certainly changed my intellectual arc, and it did PJ's as well. The point of that exhibit was to unpack the rhetorical power of maps across time. I still remember exactly how I felt when I saw some of the materials on the wall and the way they were explained. But PJ was also influenced in his interest in the structure of maps by his long career in the law, because he saw repeatedly how powerful graphic information was in terms of making legal cases, and the way in which graphic information shapes ideas and attitudes and ultimately decision-making. PJ's most important, I think, contribution to the field, as many of you know, is donating hundreds and hundreds of maps to Cornell University, where they've been digitized with his full research notes and a metadata attached. If you don't know the site, you can very easily find it by simply searching Persuasive Maps and Cornell University. And there you'll be exposed to material from the 16th century down to the day before yesterday.
Now, I've got 1491 in there.
15th century all the way down to the day before yesterday. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce PJ Mode. Please join me in welcoming him to Colorado.
Susan, thank you very much for that overly generous introduction. I had the pleasure of having lunch with Susan today, and I was reminded once again what a terrific teacher and scholar she is, and what a wonderful person. You all in Denver are very lucky to have her as part of your community. I want to thank Chris Lane and Jim Hensinger, who went above and beyond the call of duty to arrange it so that I could be here today. I apologize for sitting during this, but I've got a back problem. It's hard for me to stand for a long time. You all are map people, and so I assume that many of you are familiar with the work of Matthew Edney, the great scholar of the history of cartography. Edney's most recent book admonishes us that map scholarship has been led astray by the notion of a normative ideal, maps as one kind of thing. And one of the culprits he identifies is the misuse of the word cartography. Now, Edney suggests as a remedy that we just stop using that word altogether, except in one very narrow circumstance. Very provocative suggestion. I'm not sure we'll all be able to do that. But what it does is it reminds us that words matter. And they matter particularly when you're doing scholarly work. So tonight we're going to talk about some words, and we're going to talk about them in the mappish context. So let's start with the question of, so what does persuasive mean? Here's some synonyms for persuasive: decisive, compelling, conclusive, convincing. What these synonyms tell us is that the effort to persuade has succeeded. The viewer has seen the allegedly persuasive item and is convinced, compelled, finds it conclusive. But we know that not all persuasive maps work. Sometimes the viewer is simply got a mind made up and won't be persuaded. Sometimes, quite often actually, the persuasive map is not very well done. It's not very persuasive. I have a section on my website called "Not Very Persuasive." So it's not quite the right word. So let's look at the first time that anybody tried to identify this genre. That was 1922. Karl Haushofer, a distinguished German geographer, wrote a paper called The Suggestive Map. It's a very good paper. He sets out in the paper some of the techniques that we know today for suggestive mapping, and he discusses it particularly in the context of using suggestive mapping to achieve political objectives. So that's 1922. And the subject didn't get any scholarly interest that I'm aware of for more than a decade, until there began to be published a number of very powerful suggestive maps, and they were produced by Nazi Germany. And here's an example of one. This is the air raid peril. It's 1934. And what you see there are huge fleets of attacking airplanes in France, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. And those arcs are the range that they can travel to drop their bombs on Germany. A very provocative map. Americans began to criticize these in some scholarly papers, but during the course of the war, both sides used maps like this. This is a British map from 1941. It's well before Pearl Harbor. Britain was in a perilous position. And this is a map that was designed to raise morale by showing the places that the RAF had bombed in Germany. They actually hadn't bombed very much, but they had done some. And this was supposed to raise morale. Over time, what happened was we began to identify the German maps as propaganda and the Allied maps as information. Now, the word propaganda, you may know, has a benign history. In 1622, the Catholic Church established something called the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. Their job was to go out and find more faithful to join the church. And eventually, as time went on, the word propaganda became so much of a pejorative that in 1987, the church renamed that congregation. It is now the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. It still has its headquarters in Palazzo Propaganda Fide, and it's still located on Via Propaganda in the middle of Rome. There it is. It's halfway between the Trevi Fountain and the Spanish Steps. But notwithstanding this geographic, oh my, can you find a place to put that? I don't have to not knock it over. Thank you. Notwithstanding this geographic anachronism, propaganda is a pejorative pretty much everywhere, except in Wikipedia. If you go to Wikipedia and you enter persuasive cartography, you will be automatically redirected to a section called cartographic propaganda. Somebody ought to fix this, but life is too short and I'm not going to. So we've talked about a couple of words. We've talked about suggestive and propaganda. People have suggested didactic maps, rhetorical maps. That's a little too highfalutin. Where did persuasive maps come from? Persuasive maps come from a doctoral thesis written by Judith Tyner in 1974. She's the first one, to my knowledge, to actually use that term to embrace these maps. And Tyner, over time, has written several articles with the same title. The title has become known around, and I originally wanted to use suggestive maps for my collection. But in deference to Tyner and in deference to some family members of mine who thought that suggestive had a little bit of an off-color tone to it, I went with persuasive cartography. And the definition that I've typically used is this one: maps intended primarily to influence opinions or beliefs, but that leaves something out. What about unintentionally persuasive maps? And I took a hard look at this, and I was able to identify 4 different situations in which maps become unintentionally persuasive. Maps that are perceived differently by the viewer than what the map maker expected. Maps that are repurposed by overprinting, which is very common. Maps that are repurposed with much more elaborately. And finally, maps that have been undone by cultural change, by the passage of time. So let's look at these. Maps perceived differently than the map maker expected. So here's a quiz. How many of you have seen the movie Dunkirk? Dunkirk? Good. Yeah, we got a few. For those of you who haven't, after the Germans attacked Poland in September of 1939, the British sent a large army, an expeditionary force, to France to support the French army against the anticipated German attack. Sure enough, the attack came in May of 1940. And in a very short time, in a matter of weeks, the Germans basically destroyed the French defenses. And the French were on the run. There was a tremendous disorder. There was a loss of control. Soldiers were isolated, didn't know what to do. It was a totally chaotic situation. And into the middle of this chaos, the Germans dropped thousands and thousands of these leaflets. In the movie, they have a leaflet, but it's not this one. They tricked it up a little so it looked fancier. But basically this says, British soldiers, you're surrounded, throw down your arms and give up. You don't have a chance. What happened? A lot of soldiers just ignored it completely. Some soldiers gathered up as many copies of this as they can, because it turns out that the paper was the right size and texture to be used in connection with certain bodily functions. But there were groups of soldiers that were isolated and really had no command, didn't know what to do. One look at this map, and it was very clear. They needed to head northwest to Dunkirk, to the beaches of Dunkirk. And we know how this story ends. The British Navy and private British citizens sent boats and ships, and they managed to evacuate 330,000 soldiers from those beaches. And they went back to England, pretty much an entire army, and lived to fight another day. So in those cases, the users of this map saw it very differently than what the Germans intended. This is a tourist map of Mount Etna. Unfolded, it's quite large, it's poster size. In the center is the cone of the mountain. And you see those gray lines that seem to radiate out from the center. Each one of those lines maps a lava flow over the centuries. And each one is dated so you can find out when that particular lava flow occurred. Now, 3 years later, another tourist map was prepared. And the people who prepared it said, you know, those gray lines they're very difficult. You don't expect people to read those dates. Why don't we simply color code the lava flows by date? And so they produced this map. You won't be surprised to know that the redder the color, the more recent the lava flow. Now, I learned about this map when I saw it in a government building in Taormina, the day after my wife and I had been to the top of Mount Etna. And I have to tell you, if I'd seen it the day before, I'm not sure I would have gone up the mountain. I'm quite sure that the map makers who made this tourist map, it was designed to attract people to the mountain, really didn't intend to frighten people. But some of us, including me, found it a little frightening. Now, what about overprinting? As I said before, it's very common. Here's a nice example from 1890. This is the Portland Stove Foundry Company. They made something called the Atlantic Stove. You see a picture of it on the left. It's a big thing. You could cook with it. You could heat your home with it. It burned wood or it burned coal, very important household appliance. And they decided that they would make this pamphlet attractive by including a map. So there's the map that they included. It's a map of the Atlantic Ocean with a nice red picture of the stove plopped in the middle of it. I have not been able to identify the map maker. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to know. I actually tried and haven't so far been successful. But whoever made it certainly didn't make it to sell Atlantic stoves. This is a map from about the same time. This is a very ordinary map of France. And based on its availability in the market, I think it was not terribly successful. You can see that it's got a title up at the left, and there are 3 inset maps along the left side. It's large. It's a pretty large map. But as I say, it's not really a very distinguished map. And there's not much to say about it in 1896. But sometime between 1896 and 1903, a gunsmith named Paul Lardin, who was based in Bar-le-Duc in northeast France, had this plate printed again on larger paper. You'll notice that he's moved the title down. The inset maps are gone. And every square inch is filled with shotguns that Mr. Lardin is trying to sell. I have to tell you, when I bought this map, I was thrilled because I thought, this is crazy. I mean, who would think that the best way to sell a shotgun is to put it on a map? And I was quite confident that there would never be another dealer of shotguns who would be so foolish. I was wrong. This is a map of Italy from 1888. Again, pretty ordinary map of Italy, nothing particularly spectacular about it. It does have a very attractive title in the upper right-hand corner with a lot of good calligraphy, tells you who the map maker was and the publisher. It's a nice map. Again, this is a big map, it's poster size. Well, sometime after 1900, a gentleman named Emile Bernard, who was Belgian and a gunsmith, decided that he liked this map and he was going to use it to sell shotguns. You'll notice that he moved the very attractive title down to an inconspicuous place, and that gave him an excuse to get rid of the name of the map maker and the publisher. And he got rid of the inset map at the lower left, and he filled the rest with shotguns. Now, why in the world would 2 different gunsmiths at about the same time decide that the best thing to do would be to make a poster of a country with shotguns all over it? I have a theory. I have no way of proving it. My theory is that at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of hunting and shooting clubs in Western Europe. It was quite popular. And many of these had clubhouses. My theory is that these guys had the idea of having this printed as a poster and sending it around to hunting and shooting clubs in the hope that it would be posted on the walls as decoration. But if anybody's got a better idea, I'd love to know it. This is a cover of a book produced by a professional photographer named Jono Rotman, an interesting fellow. Rotman is from New Zealand, born and raised in New Zealand. Works a lot now in Los Angeles, but he goes back and forth to New Zealand. As a New Zealander, Rotman was aware that there are in New Zealand a handful of extremely violent, extremely dangerous gangs. We're talking about gangs that are much more violent and dangerous than what we think of when we talk about the Hells Angels in the United States. Over time, Rotman met some members of one of these gangs, actually what's really the most dangerous of the gangs. He met one of the members and he began to meet other people, and he persuaded them that he wanted to take portraits of the members of the gang. Some of them were quite distinct. And he wanted to portray the gang, and that he was not going to portray it in a negative way. And so over a period of time, he spent time with the gang, and he took a lot of pictures. There's a picture of one of the gang members, and you can see a very interesting portrait, a lot of face tattoos, the gang members wearing his leathers. It's the kind of thing that Rotman does very, very well. And the book is called Mongralism because the gang was called the Mighty Mongrel Mob Nation. That's what they called themselves. So as he was working with this gang, he found that one of the members was a bit of an amateur artist. And he said to the member, you know, if you want to draw something that's representative of the mob, of the mongrels, give it to me and maybe I'll put it in my book. And sure enough, he did. And what you see there, the green that you see there is a topographic map of New Zealand. And all of the red overprinting there is done by the mongrel artist. Those bulldog faces with the German helmets at the top are traditional symbols of the mongrels. And they very much support Nazi regalia. They wear German helmets. They use the swastika quite often in their various representations. You'll notice that there are areas of the land, particularly on the large island, large areas that are colored red. Those are areas where the mongrels have a strong presence. And the artist has used red lines to draw between those areas and some of the text. And the text is about various people in those areas. It pays tribute to them. It talks about various events that have happened and generally applauds the work and range and significance of the mongrels. We can be very sure that whoever produced that green topographic map did not intend it to be used to send this message. Now let's talk about maps that have been repurposed using more elaborate means. This is a government map. It was produced by a gentleman named Thomas Donaldson and appears in an important book published by the Public Land Commission. It's called The Public Domain, Its History with Statistics. And it's a significant book because it traces the public domain of the United States from the earliest days up to 1883, 1884. It's a huge book, 1,300 pages, filled with information. And this is one map from the book. It's a map showing the grants of land, it says, made by the government to aid in the construction of railroads. It doesn't say grants made to railroads, it says grants made. So to learn more about it, let's look at this legend in the lower left. There's the legend. And what Donaldson has told us is that as of 1884, the railroads had been granted 11 million acres of land. The states had been granted 36 million acres of land. Every time land was granted to railroads, it was typically granted to the states as well, so they could use it for public purpose or actually sell or give away the land to build up population. And you can notice the ratio is about 3-to-1. In total, 47 million acres had been granted. Now, Donaldson notes that if you filled all the grants that Congress had approved, it would take 155 million acres. For technical reasons, that was impossible. Everybody knew you couldn't fill all of them, but that was the number. That's the total it might reach someday. So 1884, there was something else going on. There was a presidential election. James Blaine against Grover Cleveland. And it was a really nasty presidential election. We think our current elections are nasty. This is the election of Ma, Ma, Where's My Pa? The Democrats were called the party of Romanism and rebellion. Susan's shaking her head. For their part, the Democrats focused on Blaine's corruption. While he was Speaker of the House of Representatives, Blaine had taken a bribe from railroads to facilitate grants of land to them. It was pretty nasty stuff. And so the Democrats produced this poster, and it's called How the Public Domain Has Been Squandered And it's kind of hard to read, so I'll show what it says in detail here. 139 million acres of the people's land have been given by Republicans to railroad corporations. I remember from the last slide, the real number was 11, not 139 million. And the maximum number that it appears that could be granted was 155 million, but if the ratio holds, the railroads are only going to get about a quarter of that. So they would have had 40 million acres. I don't know, I've tried very hard to figure out where the 139 million number came from, and I've been unsuccessful. This map is very scary. If you look at Iowa, for example, 90% of Iowa is owned by railroads, 75% of Michigan. And again, we don't know where the 139 million came from, but we know it's not right. It wasn't until, I should say that that map, I'll go back to it for a second if I can. I got to push the right. That map has legs. It was used for decades in a variety of different ways. It appears in socialist tracts at the beginning of the 20th century. It appears newspaper articles, posters, and a very respected textbook written by two extremely respected historians used a version of this map in the 1930s. It wasn't until 1945 that a serious study was done of this map. And what the study shows, the map at the top is the one the Democrats used in the poster. The map at the bottom is what really happened. Iowa wasn't 90%, it was 13%. Still a big number, but nowhere near 90. Michigan wasn't 75%, it's 9%. The fascinating question, which, and I don't know the answer to this, when the Democrats produced that poster, did they know it was wrong? Or did they simply take Donaldson's map and slap it on a poster without thinking about it? It'd be very interesting to know the answer to that. I don't know. One thing we can be sure is that Donaldson didn't intend his map to be used this way. This is quite an important map. It plays an important role. This is called the Sanitary and Social Chart of the Fourth Ward of the City of New York. It was published in 1864. In the middle of the 19th century, the social conditions and the public health conditions in New York were deplorable. There was massive overcrowding. The sanitation was completely unacceptable. And the public health of the city was under control of City Hall, which was Tammany Hall. And the jobs in the public health sphere were appointed corruptly through patronage. A group of very public-spirited citizens, important citizens of New York, people whose names now appear on the streets in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, they decided they would try to do something about this, and they organized a citizens association. And they went out and they recruited a large number of doctors and nurses and other public-spirited citizens. They then divided the city into 29 what they called sanitary districts. And they sent a team, each one led by a doctor, into each of the 29 districts to gather a raft of data on social conditions, living conditions, and sanitary conditions. They accumulated a tremendous amount of data. When they finished, they produced 17 volumes of data. Their summary report is 350 pages. They decided that they would take one of these districts and lay out the findings of the report of that district in a map. So this is the map that they chose. Now, they chose a particularly bad district in Lower Manhattan. For those of you who know New York, this is an area that's roughly between City Hall and the South Street Seaport. You can see that various buildings are color-coded to talk about living conditions, and there are some symbols. I don't know if you can see it, but there are a bunch of black squares on the map, particularly on the right-hand side. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So let's look at the legend for the map. A lot of interesting things on the legend. And let's take a close-up look. One area that's indicated are shanties or untenantable buildings. Another one is these are the black squares, every one of those black squares. These are privies in an extremely offensive condition. And just so you understand, there were also privies that weren't in an extremely offensive condition. There were places where typhus had occurred, where smallpox had occurred in the last year. And there was an indication for street sewers. In the middle of the 19th century, New York streets were clogged with horses. It was the only way for people to get around. It was the only way to move goods around the city. And I think you can imagine what a street sewer looked like under those conditions. So that was 1864. And at about the same time, there was something else going on in New York. It was related because of this overcrowding, because of these conditions. There were proposals to build elevated railways in New York. The idea was build these railways, and people who need to work in lower Manhattan can live elsewhere and simply take elevated railways. They can find less expensive housing, they can have better sanitary conditions, and it would be good for the city. This is a book, actually. It's called an expose of elevated railways. It's really what we today would call a prospectus or a proposal. And it's published by one of the companies, the Harvey Patented Railway Company. And they published a whole book arguing that it would be a terrific thing for them to get a franchise because they would run a railway up the west side of Manhattan all the way to Westchester County, where housing was less expensive. And they were competing against a number of other companies that wanted these franchises. So because they were emphasizing sanitary and social conditions, they said, what better can we do than simply take a copy of Dr. Pulling's map and stick it into our book? So that's what they did. And I'm going to show you the two legends. If you look at the upper right-hand corner of these two maps, you can see the edge of Dr. Pulling's map, and they're identical. They reproduced the map exactly. And they made some small changes in the legend. The biggest thing is the Citizens Committee report the map was to accompany the report of the Citizens Association. They renamed this a map to illustrate the necessity of elevated railways. I'm happy to report that the Citizens Association was strikingly successful. They took their massive report, 17 volumes, to the state legislature in Albany. This was regarded as a landmark in American public health. And they convinced the state legislature in 1866, the legislature adopted a brand new Metropolitan Board of Health for New York City with absolute independent control, so that it was independent of Tammany Hall, a great step forward for the city of New York. Alas, the Harvey Elevated Railway Company was not as successful. They did not get their franchise. I'm going to just take a sip of water here, if I can do that without spilling on the computer. Thank you. This is a map of Alaska. It's published by the government. 1898, this is the Yukon Gold Rush. And you see a lot of gold on the map, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. There's an inset map at the top right. I'm going to come back to that because it's actually a blow-up of an important area. But first, I want to look here at the legend down below. You can see on the right, this is a government map. It was done by the Department of Interior General Land Office. And on the left, you have a legend. And there's two things I want to show you on the legend. The most important thing is that all those areas you see on the map that are colored gold, those are regions of reported gold discoveries. And the capital letters are mine. So every place there was a report of gold discoveries, the Department of the Interior colored it gold. We don't know if there actually were any reported gold discoveries. It's just that they came to the attention of the department. And we certainly don't know if gold was found in a place and way that it could be mined and produced profitably. A lot of gold was found in the Yukon Gold Rush that simply was not economically feasible. The other thing on these legends is we're going to see some red squiggly lines, and those are routes to the interior by water and overland. So now let's go back to the inset map that I promised to show you. And in order to get you oriented, there's Juneau, Alaska at the very bottom of this map. It's a seaport. It's reachable by steamer from Los Angeles, from Seattle, from Vancouver. You could get to Juneau, Alaska. Up at the very top is Dawson City. Virtually all of the commercially feasible gold that was found, and there was a lot, virtually all of it was right near Dawson. And to give you an idea of the geography here, today, using Google Maps, and therefore traveling by whatever roads may exist, that's a 540-mile journey. Now, if you look at the red squiggles on the map between Juneau and Dawson, those are roads that can be traveled by horseback or muleback, and some of them are streams where you could take a boat and make some progress. You can imagine the difficulty of the journey from people to get from Juneau to Dawson, let alone to begin to find gold. Now, why does this matter? What's the importance of all this? Well, the announcement of the Yukon Gold Rush created a worldwide sensation. There was a recession at the time. There were a lot of people out of work. It's been estimated that as many as 100,000 people actually set out to go to Alaska to get rich. Most of them were Americans, and most of them had no idea of what they were getting into. They were unaware of the problems or even how to go about finding and mining gold. There were clerks and salesmen. And this map, or derivatives of it, and there were many, were used by promoters to sell train tickets, to sell steamer passage, to sell hotel rooms in Juneau. Tens of thousands of people actually made it to Juneau. To sell outfitting supplies, you needed a sleeping bag and warm clothing and a tent, and you needed mining equipment of some sort. You had shovels or whatever it was. To sell food, you had to pack your own food into these remote areas. To sell guide services. So thousands of people were sold various things and never found gold that was worth a penny. Obviously, this was not the intent of the Department of the Interior. I want to talk now about a gentleman named Theodore Kaufman. Kaufman was Jewish. He lived in New Jersey. He ran a theater ticket agency, apparently a successful one. It was before Pearl Harbor, and he had no particular office or stature, but he had ideas, and he was very, very concerned about the plight of German Jews. It was early in 1941, and it was clear to those who looked what was happening to Jews in Germany. And Kaufman had some ideas, and he decided he would write a book. So he wrote this book called Germany Must Perish, and he had ideas about how to make Germany perish. One of them was Germany needed to be dissected. So this map appears on the back cover of his book, and you'll notice there is no more Germany. France, Holland, Denmark, Poland, Czechoslovakia, they're all a lot better off than they were, and there is no Germany. Another one of his ideas was mandatory sterilization of all Germans. You won't be surprised to hear that Kaufman couldn't find a publisher for his book. So he self-published. He produced it himself. And he couldn't get any attention for it. So he sent copies around to every newspaper and magazine, anybody he could find who might help him get some publicity for his book. And sure enough, Time magazine decided to review the book. Now, again, it's 9 months before Pearl Harbor. Time mocked this book. They mocked it as a joke. Time concluded by saying this book, quote, is not even supposed to be ironic, close quote. It really was a flat out insult to the book. But there's no such thing as bad publicity, apparently, because the review drew people to buy the book. And people bought the books in such quantity that a second edition was printed. And it didn't take very long for a copy of this book to make its way into the hands of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda genius. Oh, I'm jumped ahead. Goebbels wrote in his diary in August of 1941, "This Jew did us a real service." This is a quote. "Had he written this book for us, he could not have made it any better." So what did Goebbels do with the book? Well, the first thing he did was he had it translated into German, and he decided he wasn't going to reproduce the entire book. What he did was he took the juiciest excerpts, the worst things that Kaufman had to say, and he put them into a slim pamphlet that could be produced cheaply on inexpensive paper with excerpts and commentary of various kinds. One of the commentaries, for example, said that Kaufman was a close associate of Franklin Roosevelt. Absolutely no truth in that. And Goebbels had 5 million copies of this booklet printed. Now, I want to say that Kaufman's ideas weren't just a one-time benefit to the Germans. Kaufman and his ideas appeared in newspapers, in flyers, in posters. His words and ideas were being used as late as 1944. But the first use was this booklet, and I should say that you won't be surprised to know that Kaufman's map was exactly reproduced on the back of this booklet. And they even have Kaufman's title to it across the top, and across the bottom is a German title, which says that the world plutocracy is planning to dismantle Germany. Now, I mentioned that Goebbels had 5 million copies of this book printed. How in the world do you distribute 5 million copies of something to people in a way they're actually going to look at it in the middle of a war? It's easy. There was rationing. If you wanted meat, you needed ration cards. When you went to pick up your ration cards, they were tucked inside a copy of this booklet. And so millions of Germans got this booklet in a way that they were likely to look at it. As an aside, I will say that I bought my copy of this booklet quite a while ago from a German dealer. And when it arrived, it had these 2 green pieces of paper in it. Those are German meat ration coupons. They're each signed by someone. There are 2 people who live at the same address, perhaps family. And on the back, there are notations which I'm pretty sure show the amounts of meat that were drawn at different times against the ration quantity. So just a word on provenance, which as collectors, we've got to love. Again, Kaufman it's been written that Kaufman was unknown to Americans. No one in America knew who Theodor Kaufman was, but it's been written that every German schoolboy knew his name. The last group I want to talk about are maps that have been outdated by cultural change. They're different. There's a couple of good examples of this, but the best example is colonialization. So here's a French map to the glory of our overseas empire. There's Africa, the French colonies are highlighted. You see this wonderful cartouche, a well-dressed North African, perhaps a Berber. There's a black native wearing a loincloth. And then there's a classic colonials with a pith helmet. And the text on the left and right glorifies the various explorations. Today, we don't really regard this colonization as quite so glorious. Now, Americans weren't exempt from this. This is from the Spanish-American War period. It's a map of the United States with a giant figure of Uncle Sam stretched across the country. He's got his toe on the Philippines. He's got his hand on Cuba, smoking a big cigar, and he's got a smirk on his face. And observing him are the figures of the leaders of France, Russia, Germany, and Britain. And they're so tiny that a viewing platform had to be built for them so they could actually see Uncle Sam. The caption under this map reads, "How the old world regards Uncle Sam nowadays, a modern colossus." So American colonialism. But I've saved the best for last, of course, and that's British colonialism. It's 1899. What historians have called the scramble for Africa was well underway. Every major European nation was aggressively trying to establish African colonies. And their work had been essentially blessed, in a sense, by the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. Harry Johnston was a British, he was a longtime colonial administrator in Africa. And he wrote this book. It is mostly, as it's titled, a history of the colonization of Africa. But at the end of the book, Johnston poses a question, and Johnston was apparently a significant figure. He'd been knighted by the king. At the end of the book, he poses a significant question. What is Europe going to do with Africa? And this map is his response. It's called The Colonizability of Africa. And there's a legend at the bottom. It's color-coded, and I'm going to help you because you can't read it. The pink on the map, that shows areas where essentially European states may be formed. And in the south, of course, it's South Africa. The Cape Colony is specifically shown on the map. In the north, you've got Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, but just a little band there. And those are the easy places. Saharan Africa is a different matter. Unfortunately, that's an area where warlike or enlightened natives might prevent European colonization. Horrors, they've become enlightened and we may not be able to colonize them. But not to worry, because that large gray area is sub-Saharan Africa. And in that area, we have unhealthy but exploitable Africa, great commercial value, inhabited by docile, governable races. Africa of the trader and planter and of despotic European control. Given what I collect, I do see some nasty maps from time to time. This one is really cringeworthy. And one thing we can say for sure is that it is perceived today in a way that is exactly the opposite of what Sir Harry intended. So we've looked at a bunch of maps, and I think we can conclude that whether or not the original map was intended to be persuasive, the effect of the map is now different. And it's perhaps antithetical to the intent of the original mapping. So when we talk about persuasive cartography, and that means me too, because I've had to change the way I talk about it, we ought to be talking about maps whose primary intent or effect is to influence opinions or beliefs. That's all I have. There's a way to get to my website, but as you heard before, if you simply Google persuasive maps, it'll pop up at Cornell. I hope you will. I hope you have questions because that's the most fun. And I want to say I apologize for sitting during all this. I've got a back problem and I can't stand for a long time. So, yeah, I am. Yeah, for those who are on Zoom and couldn't hear, the question is, there's a Reddit map site where people post propaganda maps and argue about it in the commentary. And a lot of maps have many maps have some distasteful elements in it. And how do you moderate that? When I was designing with Cornell, when I was designing my website, I had the option of permitting comments. And I very quickly, for just the reason you cite, decided that was a very bad idea. My notion is that there's scholarly value in these maps. First, there's scholarly value in helping people understand that maps aren't exactly what you think they are. And I gave a talk one time and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, I'll never look at another map again. And I said, I love it. That's great. That's exactly what you ought to say. I'm sorry, I'll never look at another map the same way again. I said, I love it. That's exactly right. So that's one of my purposes. And the other thing is scholars use these maps for all sorts of purposes. I keep track as best I can of how my maps are used. Some of them are used in books on maps, but a lot of them are not used on books or maps. A lot of them are used on books on slavery, books on suffrage, books on World War II. A lot of the colonization maps are used in articles that are about the history of something that's going on in Africa and what nations were doing. They're used as examples. So this is material that helps scholars like Susan focus on or illustrate points they're trying to make. It's when I first started to get a handle on how my maps were being used, I was surprised. I thought they would be used mostly in books that were sort of map books of various kinds, and they are used in those books, but the great majority of their uses is not. So as far as I'm concerned, yes, anything in this area is best moderated, and left to the gaggle of people on the internet, it's not very useful. And I see two uses, as I said, one educating people about maps and the other making material available to scholars in other areas. I'm shocked sometimes to see that somebody far away in Europe has written an article. I've got articles in Spanish on extremely different subjects in which my maps are cited. So that's the best I can do on that. Yeah.
How do you think social media and artificial intelligence will impact what you just talked about?
Great question. Well, social media is what it is. We all know about that. There's a problem that's actually been around before artificial intelligence, and that the problem is this: like a lot of other things, the contemporary mapping has moved from paper to the internet. So at one point, I tried to do a little analysis of my collection. I asked myself, what are the areas where the collection is weak, where I don't have a lot of stuff? And one I identified was the area of the environmental area. Why did I not have a lot of environmental maps? The answer is pretty clear. The environmental movement really began to blossom about the time that the internet, or shortly before the internet began to blossom. And if you're doing a persuasive map, if you're trying to make a point about something, about the environment, rather than do a printed map and try to distribute it, you're going to do an online map. And that way, you're going to broadcast it all over the world. It'll have much more distribution. And there's a tremendous amount of environmental mapping, persuasive maps of the environment online. And it's really hard to find printed maps. I've found some, but not a lot. So AI is going to make it worse. It's just going to make it easier for people to do that. The caution is the same caution as one has with a printed word, and that is buyer beware. One of the reasons maps have verisimilitude. People believe maps. Most of the people in this room, most of us at least, grew up with parents who, when you got in the car to go someplace new, they unfolded a map. You know, younger people now get in the car and they turn on the GPS. They trust the map. It's going to get you where you want to go. And so maps, more than many other things, are believed. And that means we have to be more careful when we're looking at a map to think about where it came from and why. I'm not sure that's an answer, but I'm not sure there is a really good answer to that question.
Well, I guess the question is, it applies to all of artificial intelligence: transparency, truthfulness, deepfakes,
Yes.
hallucinations, blah, blah, blah. So I guess is there some way, or should there be some way to watermark them or attribute copyright infringement, like everything that's going on with AI? I'm just wondering whether the professional map people need to sort of rethink the profession.
That's,
Repeat the question.
I'm sorry,
Repeat the question.
I'm not sure I can repeat it very well. Do we need to do something to give people warning about what's going on? Should professional map producers rethink things? Is there something like watermarking we can do? I don't know. I really, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be somewhere else on a yacht. I do know, again, maps are the most dangerous of all. 30 years ago, I would have said maps and photographs. But since the advent of Photoshop, we know to be very careful in trusting photographs. We've learned that. People haven't learned that about maps. And so I believe that maps are actually, in a sense, the most dangerous medium. And if I were trying to educate a populace about something, I would look for maps every time. And then partly that's my prejudice, but it's all things considered, pound for pound, it's the best way to get people to believe you. And that's dangerous unless people understand how to look at maps. In the back.
I'm thinking about the word fake as a term, because you're using words at the beginning, but I didn't see the word fake up there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, great question. What about the word fake? I didn't use it. It's not a very precise word. Is the railroad map that I showed you, is that a fake? It's taken from another map that was drawn in good faith. I do have a lot of maps that are just plain old-fashioned fraud, intentionally deceptive maps. But I actually don't like the word fake because I find it imprecise. And there's maps can be misleading and wrong in a whole variety of ways. And fake is a little too vague. So it's a word I try to stay away from. Susan.
You've observed that these types of maps exploded in the 20th century, World War I forward. And of course, we can imagine all kinds of non-map related reasons for that, right? Print technology, whatever. But I'm wondering, in your research, if you could reflect for us whether you have ideas about the way in which this type of vernacular map just sort of proliferated. Are there other reasons that you think are behind that?
Well, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that there weren't suggestive maps before World War I. There were a lot of them, the religious maps particularly, but there were a lot of things in the 19th century and 18th century. The Haushofer's article and other work that was done at about the same time resonated with a lot of German scholars. Susan, you know this. There were a group of German map people who felt, after World War I, in general, the idea, there was an overtone in Germany that the people had been betrayed by the leadership. It hadn't done the right job. And one of the currents of that was they hadn't produced propaganda maps the way the Allies had. I don't think that's true, but that was the belief. And there was an active group of people working on suggestive mapping in the 20s and into the early 30s. And if you go to my collection, you'll see their names. There was somebody named Ziegman. There was a Dr. Lange, Lange. I always remember him because he had 2 PhDs and he insisted on being called Dr. Lange. And it appears on maps. And these people were thinking about this and working on this before the Nazis came to power. And now in World War II, it just exploded. I mean, it was just crazy. In World War I, there was, I'm going to forget the name of the guy. There was Wilson set up a propaganda bureau, which he didn't call Citizens. George Creel, that's the name, exactly. The Creel Committee. And they were basically in charge of American propaganda. They created units in every state. There were state units of his committee, and they published their posters. I have a number of posters. I have 4 or 5 posters or books, maps from books in my collection that come from that time. So the Americans were on it big time at some point in World War I. A lot of it was at the outset in trying to persuade Americans that we ought to be in the war, and it was the right thing because you had a large German American population that didn't want to fight with the Germans, and you had a large Irish population that didn't particularly want to help the Brits. So there were political problems at the beginning. But aside from that, Susan, I don't know. Of course, the technology it just became cheaper and cheaper. And once you could do color lithography in huge volume, very inexpensive. Of course, that was early. It constantly became so easy to do during this period of time.
So I was wondering, are you familiar with the concept of paper towns?
I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with the concept of paper towns? So essentially what it was map makers were afraid that people would take their copyrighted information
Yes.
and publish it. So they would put fake towns
Yes.
on the map.
Yes.
It's like, well, there's this Appleton that doesn't actually exist. That's
Yes.
But something that I learned when I learned about the concept of paper towns was actually working with Chris's map shop. A lot of the places that put paper towns on the maps did so in strategic ways, not just to catch someone with their pants down on the map, but also to make the areas that they were selling look more interesting. Like, for instance, there's one in Colorado where there's a bunch of settlements that never actually existed, but are put all throughout the San Luis Valley around also a non-existent lake. So I was wondering if you're familiar with the concept, do you think that would fall under more of just sort of fraud or prevention of fraud, or is it also persuasive because you're putting things on there that aren't there for a legitimate purpose, but you're trying to do so in such a way as to get people to buy your maps because they think this area is more hospitable, it has more resources?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, it's intentionally deceptive because there aren't those cities, but it certainly is a persuasive map. And I wish you would send me an email giving me the names of some of those maps, because just a map that has a non-existent town on it in order to protect yourself from people who are violating your copyright, that's not a persuasive map. That's just a clue. But if they're done to persuade people that a part of Colorado is really interesting because it has some frontier towns, that's a persuasive map. Now, one thing I've never been able to find, during the Cold War, the Russians produced a lot of maps mislocating important cities where there were atomic and nuclear facilities. And I've never been able to find one of those. I haven't read much about it. It's something I would like to get my hands on at some point, but I've never really followed the rabbit down into the hole.
We had a speaker talking about Russian cartography, internal cartography, where as a sort of preventative measure against revolution and rebellion, they would deliberately change scales on domestically produced maps. Like you'd have roads that wouldn't intersect, or there would be curves that wouldn't fit. So if that's what they were doing for their internal distribution, I can only imagine the level of artificially induced, I guess, error. If you're doing it deliberately, it's still error, but that it would be sending outwards.
Yeah, it's intentionally deceptive because it was easy for intelligence to learn the names of places where secret research and activity was going on, but it wasn't always so easy to be sure exactly where they were. So you could move them 50 miles or 100 miles. I don't have one of those. I'd like to. I'm still collecting, although I've tried desperately to slow down. Anything else? Great questions. I really like the questions.
I'm trying to think how to word this question, but do you have any insight on like the subconscious perception that we might have, especially with colors, but especially with details on that. Like, for example, your map of Mount Whitney, I think it was, right? That you had up
I can't hear you.
and yeah, the map that you had on there, the map that showed the lava streak,
Yes.
right? And how it was colored red, whereas like maybe a yellow or a blue would have changed your opinion of the map, right? So yeah, I guess my question is, how much of the subconscious perception of colors especially changes the viewer's opinion or the map maker's opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, are there things like color and other techniques that are particularly effective or not effective in persuading people? Is that the question?
Yes.
It's a great question. And there have been studies of that. There are papers on that subject. Red, of course, is extremely important. It's very funny. Red is sometimes used dramatically to emphasize good things, like where the British Empire is and where the mighty mongrels are strong. We use red. On the other hand, red is also a symbol of danger. So the one thing we know for sure is red evokes strong emotions. Strong emotions. And there have been, this is way outside of my expertise, but there have been articles and papers written about that. There's also the question of symbols, what kind of symbols to use. Solid circles or filled in circles. The variety is very large of how to do these things. One of the most interesting techniques of persuasive cartography is selective exclusion. What is it that you decide to leave off the map? And that can be done very skillfully. It's also, if you know what you're looking at, then it's also a tip-off that somebody's fooled around with the map. But that's done quite often. It's done, I have one of my talks online, I talk about some resorts in the Canadian Rockies that competed with each other, and they put out various maps. Each of them put out maps of how easy it is to get there and how beautiful they are. And each of the people who put them out was very careful to position things on their map and to orient them so the other resort was not on the map. And that's the kind of thing that is quite interesting. And for the viewer, if you don't know anything about the Canadian Rockies and you want to go to a resort, you see one of these maps, you can't tell that lovely picture of the hotel has been put where it is because it's right on top of where the other resort is. You just don't know. Anything else?
No, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, PJ, for starting this next month with such a great presentation on the persuasive maps. And this is going to continue next week with Susan Schulten that will keep us going on this theme. So thank you so much, and everybody online, and we'll see you next week.